And thank you for inviting me to come to this assembly, I want to say weekend today. And I'm going to be sharing with you some research that arose. I work at George Fox. I'm a professor of Spanish, and part of my role at George Fox is to carry out research. I've been attending Spanish-speaking churches ever since I was in college, and I found myself realizing that most of my English-speaking companions at church know very little about Spanish-speaking churches. And so I found myself in a position I felt where I was kind of a bridge between the very vibrant Spanish-speaking believers in the Northwest and the English-speaking believers who didn't know very much about what was going on in those churches very much. And so over the course of time, I did a lot of research in Oregon on Protestant Spanish-speaking churches, and recently published a book about it, and I point the right way. So what I'm going to do today is share a little bit of background and then go right into some models of sharing and collaboration between English-speaking churches and Spanish-speaking congregations that emerged as I was carrying out this study. You probably have heard a lot of the buzz that the Hispanic population is now the largest minority group in the United States in the 21st century. And my research focused on the churches of Oregon, but I do have information for Washington as well. The Hispanic population in Oregon between 1990 and 2000 grew by 144%. And then between the period of 1990 to 2010, it grew by a 300% increase. Now, if the numbers initially are pretty small, it's pretty easy to get a 300% increase. So in Oregon, the latest census data shows just over 450,000 people who self-identify as Latino, which is 11.1% of the population. Okay. Are you folks over there able to see what's up here? Should I turn out the light? Would that make it too dark?
I think turning out the light would help.
Okay. Let's try to hit the switch back there. Great, thank you. So it is 450,000 is about the current number in Oregon, although many people believe that census data count lower than the actual number of Latinos. Some people are concerned about giving kind of information to the government, and so there may be many more than show up on the census. For the state of Washington, in the same period, 1990 to 2000, the population increased by 114%. From 1990 to 2010, it went up by 232%. So it's a smaller increase, but the overall population is larger in terms of actual numbers, and it's about the same percentage-wise of the population of the state. And my apologies, I apparently wasn't paying attention carefully enough to remember that there would be representatives from Montana and other states here, so I didn't do that for you. But so anyhow, the Hispanic population in both of those states in the Northwest is growing. But people tend to think of Spanish speakers as being Catholic and not as being Protestant. But actually, many studies done across the nation show that between 20 and 33% of Latinos living in the United States are Protestant and are not Catholic. As I've done this research, I've kept a list of Spanish-speaking churches in Oregon, gleaned through the internet. I notice one when I'm driving down the street and I write it down, talking to different pastors and believers in different areas. And so there are over 230 Spanish-speaking Protestant churches in Oregon. And I would imagine that there's a similar or higher number in Washington State. So this is it's not a small phenomena with it's a significant number of people. But as I said earlier, what I found was the people that were English-speaking believers didn't know very much about these churches. Way back in 2006, I started doing this research, and I have been supported very generously by George Fox by them giving me research grants and also giving me a sabbatical last fall so I could go get a book written. What I did was I identified 25 churches that were Spanish-speaking churches, and I wanted to get a big mix. So the churches that I identified were differing in size, differing in age, differing in denominational background or ties. And then I attended a regular worship service at these churches, and then I followed up with an interview of the pastor. two of the pastors that I interviewed were pastoring two congregations, and so in their interviews they gave me information about both congregations, so I ended up with data on 27 churches. I started out with Washington County, which is Hillsborough, Aloha, Beaverton in Oregon, has a very high percentage of Hispanic population. Then I went to look at Portland area, the Multnomah County, and I thought, yeah, this is good. This is, bulk of the population lives here. But my research colleagues said, no, you're not done. You need to include the rural areas, because if you don't, you're really not painting a true picture of the state. So then I did, and I went to these other areas, and these are the cities in rural Oregon that I visited. The coast specifically was Newport, and central Oregon specifically was Madras. So then these are the churches that I visited, and I ended up with very old churches. The Mennonite Iglesia Pentecostés in Woodburn is, I believed, was the oldest Spanish-speaking Protestant church in the state. However, Wendell tells me no, there is one in Salem that is even older. So there's misinformation in my book that I just found out about today. What were they? They were a Christian and Missionary Alliance, a Mennonite Brethren Church, a Quaker Church, Iglesia de Dios Pentecostal, Movimiento Internacional. That is a denomination that began in Puerto Rico. So it's a Latin American denomination. Southern Baptist Church, a Christian church, Church of Jesus Christ with an apostolic background, one called Manantiales de Vida that has, like, there's 3 churches of that denomination on the West Coast. It's very small. 2 Mennonite churches, so the one in Woodburn and the one in Portland with Pastor Moran. 2 Foursquare churches, 3 Assemblies of God, 3 Elim and El Shaddai are neo-Pentecostal churches that began in Central America, and they have sent missionaries to the United States, or they have had people that have emigrated from those churches who've come to LA and then moved up into Oregon and to the West Coast, who have wanted to bring their pastors, people trained in their kind of doctrine and their format and their structure. 3 non-denominational churches and 5 conservative Baptist congregations. And I'll talk about why there's kind of this imbalance in so many conservative Baptists in my mix in just a minute. So you start, when you're doing a research project, you start with a literature review. And so I set out to read everything I could find about Spanish-speaking Protestants in the Northwest. Well, guess what? There is one article in a book. And so then I said, okay, let's just see what I can find about Spanish speakers in the Northwest. And really, there are about 5 books or reports, book-length reports, about the Hispanic population of Oregon. There's very little published, and part of that is because the Spanish-speaking population in Oregon and in Washington has been present a long time, but not in significant numbers. The significant numbers began in the mid-'80s. With the IRCA reform, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and with amnesty, and there was this flood of people that came in the mid-1980s, and so that's when the significant numbers of population, and so there just hasn't been a lot of time for people to write research reviews, okay? So then I said, well, this isn't enough, and this is not telling me what I need to know, so then I said, I'm going to read everything I can find about Hispanic churches in the United States, which is what I did, and so certain themes began to emerge. And it was not, because I want to go back a page, it was not a pretty picture. I came out of this thinking, man, I'm reading all this stuff, and I'm going to go to visit these churches, and I'm going to interview these pastors, and I'm going to just get all of this negative information. The reason that I thought that, partly was my own experience, and my husband Benoit has pastored 3 different Hispanic congregations in Oregon, and I was the pastor's wife, and it was often a very difficult and negative experience in our interactions with the English-speaking church. So in my own life, I thought it might be difficult. And what I was reading also had many negative things on it. So the first theme that came through was this theme of paternalism. Well, that's kind of a $10 word. So this is a dictionary definition. The policy or practice on the part of people in positions of authority of restricting the freedom and responsibilities of those subordinate to them in the subordinate's supposed best interest. So I was talking about this to a lady that attended one of the churches that my husband pastored, an Anglo woman, and she said, yeah, it's like we English speakers were the parents, and the Hispanics were the kids. That's paternalism. And I thought, well, yeah, you got it right. You told us what we could do and what we couldn't do. And so that is a theme that many other researchers about Spanish-speaking churches found in relationship with English-speaking churches or with denominations. Another theme that came through was an attitude of superiority. Sometimes it was expressed in kind of funny ways where an English speaker might say, yes, our little brothers and sisters, ha ha ha, because they're referring to their short stature. It's also expressed in kind of an attitude of, where is this church, if they're going to meet within our building, going to meet? And so the practice of having the Spanish speakers in a small room in the basement is well documented. From the 1960s in New York City all the way through to places closer to home. And Benoit and I were visiting a church in our denomination in Portland that was wanting to have a Spanish-speaking congregation, and we were taking a tour of this giant building, and we said, well, where would you like the congregation to meet? And he said, well, in the basement, but there's a bathroom right here, and you're right next to the kitchen. And we said, well, why couldn't we use the sanctuary? And he said, well, you'd have to turn the heat on. And so that is kind of this attitude that it's okay to turn the heat on for the English speakers, but it's not okay to turn the heat on for the Spanish speakers. And that attitude, unfortunately, still is out there. Racism was another thing that came through, and you know, there's one woman describing Texas in the 1930s, so far away and long ago, tells a story of a Mexican man who had come to Christ, and an Anglo woman was welcoming into the fellowship and to being a new believer, and two other Anglo women were standing nearby, and one of them said, well, if they're going to accept people like him here, I'm not coming anymore. And it goes on to relate that the man went away with a broken heart because he felt that stab of racism very early in his Christian walk. Now, that was Texas in the 1930s. That is not now. Except that one article written in the 1990s about Washington State said the same thing. Basically, that relationships between English-speaking churches and Spanish-speaking churches are often very tense because of racism on the part of both groups, actually. Then another thing, I was very encouraged as I walked in today to see Wendell back there interpreting with the headset, because another thing that many of the studies talked about was functional exclusion, meaning, yes, we're going to have Spanish-speaking churches, but when it comes to making decisions, to having statewide meetings, or even to being able to hear what the keynote speaker is saying, Spanish speakers have many times been excluded from participating in that, whether it's not having an interpreter or not inviting them to participate on committees or be in meetings or anything like that. So those are some of the themes. And so, as I said, I started this research and did my interviews and all of these church visits kind of fearful as to what I would find. One of the things that became very clear very soon is that not all English speakers and not all Spanish speakers have the same vision for what a relationship between the two groups in a church building or in a denomination could be or should be. And so there are pretty much three different visions that emerged, both in what I read and both in what I saw in Oregon. And so the first is that having a Spanish-speaking congregation meet in your building is a temporary measure with the goal of separation and independence. So this is one model that English-speaking churches and Spanish-speaking churches have for sharing a building. It's temporary. And some of the reasons for this are, well, that's an indication of maturity. I had Spanish-speaking pastors say to me, you tell those gringos not to give us a handout. We need to stand on our own 2 feet. We need to be mature. We need to be able to learn to take responsibility and take care of things and take care of leadership positions. And we have to grow up and do things on our own. And we don't want to create ongoing dependence. Okay? So the ability to move out into another building, to have all of your own governance systems that run and are staffed, is an indication of maturity. And so many English-speaking churches will say, yeah, let's do this. It's a temporary helping hand kind of thing, but it's a hand up, not a hand out. Spanish-speaking churches may also have this goal of separation and independence as a means to provide for some cultural preservation. As children are born in the United States, and by the way, the increasing number of Hispanics in the United States is no longer due to immigration. Immigration is actually in a negative right now. The increasing number of Hispanics in the United States is due to children being born to those who are in the United States already. So it's children who are born Americans. But because the children go to school in English, church may be the only place where they use Spanish in a meaningful way, other than talking with their parents at home. So it may be the only place where they actually open and use a text, a book, in Spanish. And so many Spanish-speaking congregations feel that this is important, that church is a place where children and traditions and music styles and family relationships and all those kinds of things can be preserved and extended at church. Another reason, and I would say probably those top three are pretty positive reasons for this goal. Sometimes, and this is often unspoken, there's kind of a negative reason for this type of model for a church, and that is an unwillingness to mingle on part of both groups. Now, I am a gringa, born in Oregon to gringo parents, and so I say this, I know that some of you sitting in the audience as you listen to this go, oh, it's just all our fault. Well, that is absolutely not the truth. There is fault on both sides. I know well, one very well and another one not so well. But a pastor in Hillsboro said, I could not, it took me months to get the people to come into our church building. These particular people in Hillsboro, Oregon, are from the Yucatan Peninsula, which is a very indigenous part of Mexico. And Mexico is just as racist or more than the United States. And so these are indigenous people who do not speak Spanish as their first language. They speak a dialect as their first language, a Mayan dialect. And for centuries, they have been the lowest of the low on the social structure. And they've been downtrodden not only by first by the other Mayan groups, and then by the Spaniards, and then by the Mexican nationals, and by the mixed blood mestizos in Mexico. And so it's part of who they are, to expect to not be accepted, to expect to be stepped on. And so I hope that at some point, as Christ works in their lives and their hearts, that will change. But they're afraid to go in and interact with the English speakers, no matter how big the smile is, no matter how friendly they are. And also I had another pastor actually in Southern Oregon, in Medford, say the same thing. But he said, I think my people are ashamed because they've been here 20, 25 years and they don't speak very much English. And they're embarrassed that they don't speak more English. And so they don't want to get together, even though the English speakers in our church have invited them many, many times to do things together. It's not because the Anglos are grinchy, it's because the Hispanics won't do it. So there's an unwillingness sometimes on both parts. So this is one vision, that a Hispanic church could meet in your building as a temporary measure. Okay? The second vision was, it's also a temporary measure, but it's only going to be temporary because eventually they're all going to learn English and they're just going to worship with us. And there are some big churches. City Bible Church is a large church with multiple campuses in the Portland area, and that's what they're saying. They're saying this generation that doesn't speak English is soon going to die out, or is soon going to learn English. And all the kids speak English anyhow. They just go to our youth group. They just are in our kids' programs along with everybody else. It's all done in English. So everybody's going to be happy worshiping together. Okay? That is possible because the children and the youth speak English. But that shows an attitude, and I think this varies from individual to individual. They're saying the only barrier to us worshiping together is really a language barrier. It's not a cultural barrier. And there is some research written by Hispanics who say, I can go to a church service in English in the same denomination, and it was a liturgical denomination, but I just don't feel like I've gone to worship. when it's in English, because perhaps the music is different, the way people greet each other is different, and so maybe there is some evidence that says there are cultural reasons why people might want to worship with others of their same culture or not, okay? But this model will only really truly work if there is no ongoing immigration. If there aren't new people coming in who only speak Spanish, because if there are continuous people coming in, then you're always going to have that group that can't worship in English. All right? So that's a second vision that some churches have, just saying, you know what, we're all going to eventually become one, and we're all going to do this all together in English. Okay. And then there is a third thing, and this was not described in any of the literature that I read. Oops, sorry. Go back. And so I didn't expect to find it. There was no description of a Spanish-speaking congregation and an English-speaking congregation meeting together in the same building as a permanent state, kind of as what is normal, kind of as having the goal of an expanded vision of what the kingdom of God is, and that part of that requires mutual learning about culture and about Christianity in a way that I need you, who are different from me and yet similar, to teach me what the kingdom of God may look like. And as I said, this was not in anything that I had read that had been published in the United States about Hispanic churches, so I didn't expect to find it. But lo and behold, 1/3 of the churches that were in my study said this is their vision. And so this was something that is perhaps new, perhaps hasn't been described very well. So these churches, the Baptist Church in Hillsborough, Rogue Valley Fellowship in Medford, Christian Church in Monmouth, all over the state, said, we are one body. We have 2 languages, or in the case of Village Baptist, they have like 4 languages. They have a congregation of Chinese, they have a congregation of Vietnamese, and they have a Spanish-speaking congregation. But we are one church. We are one body. We just happen to have 2 different language and cultural groups. And this is the way we're planning on being, and this is an integral part of who we are as a church. So I'd like to kind of unpack this a little bit because it seems so unique to the Northwest. The things that these churches share are, and I will describe these a little bit more in detail, vision and identity. In other words, we are who we are because we include both groups. And without one of the groups, we will not be the church that God is calling us to be. They share the building. They share finances. This means that the Spanish speakers contribute their tithes and offerings, and the English speakers contribute their tithes and offerings. I'm getting ahead of myself, okay? They share responsibilities for church activities and leadership. And in some cases, they shared fellowship and worship, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The most integrated model was the Mennonite Brethren Church in Grants Pass. And some of you, I think, have some ties to Pastor Stutzman down there. But this church was so surprising. We walked in there on a Sunday morning, and we saw all these Anglos, and we're like, where's the Spanish-speaking service? And they're saying, well, it's here with us. They have a common Sunday morning service. The Spanish speakers and the English speakers worship together at the same time in the same sanctuary in both languages. They have both Spanish speakers and English speakers on the worship team. And as a person needs to speak up in the service, they just do it in the language they're most comfortable in. So the pastor says, okay, it's time for prayer requests. And a Hispanic lady stands up and blah, 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 in Spanish. And somebody interprets so the rest of the congregation can know. Or a pastor says, brother so-and-so, will you open in prayer? So brother so-and-so, who is Hispanic, stands up and prays in Spanish, and they didn't interpret that. Everybody just knew, well, he's doing the opening prayer. You know, I mean, you know what's supposed to be in an opening prayer, so you knew from context. All of the songs were bilingual. They have 2 hymnals. They have a red hymnal and a blue hymnal, and the bulletin says, red hymnal 307, blue hymnal 102. And they stand up and they sing at the same time in both languages in kind of this Pentecostal, Day of Pentecost kind of a thing. It's very interesting. Now the pastor doesn't speak very much Spanish. He says, I get by, but he said, I'd never dare to preach in Spanish. So he preaches in English, but he does something very interesting, and as a language teacher, this is very smart, actually. Instead of just giving a sermon outline in the bulletin where there's like, you know, one space to fill in each main point, he puts pretty much his whole text in the bulletin, written out, word for word, but he takes out more words. So it actually becomes a fill-in-the-blank activity. You listen for the key word, oh, there it is, you fill it in, and that's really good for a language learner because you're hearing it and you're seeing it at the same time and you can follow along really well. Would someone mind opening that door? I think it's kind of quieted down out there and it's really hot in there, and it's after lunch. Yeah, great, thank you. And this works in this situation in Grants Pass because most of the people have lived in the United States for 20 to 25 years. So their ability to understand English is really pretty good. Their ability to speak Spanish may not be as good, but listening is what we call a passive receptive skill, and you can do that if you've been exposed to it much more easily than you can actually produce the words. So for his congregation, this works for the Spanish speakers. So the bulletin with the blanks to follow, okay?
I have a question regarding that. Was it started that way?
No, the church, as I understand
Does
it,
that make a difference if you start that way versus
I
wanting
think
to
it would
change
make
to
a difference. Pastor Stutzman told me that his parents had gone there to plant this church. And so he's kind of following along in their footsteps. And at some time, I believe he said in the early 1980s, they noticed the Hispanic congregation around, a population around them, and wanted to reach out to them. And they started with a Bible study in Spanish. But instead of trying to find a Spanish-speaking pastor and separate, and I don't know why exactly they chose to go this route, they just chose the English speakers to adapt and put up with hearing songs in Spanish in their service. So I don't know, but I mean it was built in, and he did say this is not an only rose-colored picture, because he did say we have found it a little bit difficult to grow because not everybody is comfortable, not everyone is willing to go to their Sunday morning service and have it be a little bit different like this. So he did see that, he did mention that, but they felt that their congregation felt very strongly that that was what they needed to do. So then most of the churches of these 9 churches were what I would call medium integration. So they shared decision making. This is really important. There were Spanish speakers or Hispanic congregants on their church boards and on their committees. So it wasn't a case of the Anglos sat around a table and decided something and then informed the Hispanics that this is how it was going to be, but actually there were Hispanic voices involved in the decision making. So in board and other leadership positions, one of the churches that I visited, the director of missions is a Hispanic, and another one, the leader of whatever you call the person in charge of the building, what do you call them, stewards, or whatever. Every church kind of has a different way. But so they have important roles, and some of them, and all of these churches actually, the Spanish-speaking pastor was a full-time staff member. He was not a bivocational pastor, so he was on the full-time staff of the church, and so he attended all of the staff meetings and all of the board meetings, so he was always in the loop. Okay, so it wasn't, again, kind of a, we made this decision, now you guys go carry it out. The shared finances, I started to talk about this. All the money goes into a common pot, and then it's all accessed by either group following common procedures for access to the money. So it's not like, well, the Hispanics only gave $200 this month, so that's all they can spend. It was, no, it all went into the general fund or whatever, to the operating money, and you guys are having a baby shower, well, turn in your receipts, just like you guys are having a baby shower and you turn in your receipts. Another pastor of a very large church said, oh, it's like a youth group. And I said, what? He said, well, yeah, the youth group is a ministry item and it has a budget line. Now, the youth may not contribute very much in their tithes and offerings, but they're an integral part of the ministry of the church, and so you spend money on the youth group. So I guess, I don't know, I had never thought of it that way. I guess I was on the benefiting end of being in a youth group a lot. then there's very much of a sense of shared responsibility. So it's not, this is our building and we're letting you guys in it. The Hispanic pastor said to me, we have worked very hard to inculcate in our group a sense of, this is our building and we better take care of it too. So when there's a work day, when they're, they've taken the van out, we're going to clean it out, we're going to get it washed, we're going to do everything that has to be done because it's ours. We're responsible for it. One church, under their missionary model, the missionaries come in and they have an English-speaking service in the morning and a Spanish-speaking service at night. And they said, we don't let any missionary come unless they commit to be at both services. We provide an interpreter, but our Hispanics contribute and they pray, and they need to know what's going on in the mission field, and they're just as much involved in supporting the missionaries as the Anglos are. And then in the large church, Village Baptist, the pastors are on call. So they've got a Chinese pastor and a Vietnamese pastor and a Spanish-speaking pastor and an Anglo pastor. And so if I were to go in the hospital on a Tuesday and it was the Chinese pastor's day on call, I would be visited in the hospital by the Chinese pastor, not by the Anglo pastor. And the whole body understands this. All of the pastors are shepherding all of the congregation. Their primary responsibility is to their culture and language group, but it does not exclude them from ministering to the others. And this was also really neat. The church in Central Oregon that I visited, they moved out of the English-speaking building into their own building that's on a ways off the property, but they're still in connection. And they had their 30th anniversary, and we went to that. And the pastor of the English-speaking congregation recently died, and his widow spoke, and she said, you always ministered to us so much. It was the biggest mistake we ever made to let you guys out of our building, because in those passing times in the hallway, in the foyer, and when her husband had been very ill for an extended period of time, she felt that the Hispanic congregation had ministered tremendously to them. And she said, we always thought we were ministering to you, but it was the other way around. So there is a sense of shared responsibility. And then a key thing is sharing worship and fellowship. And I know that some of you have Spanish-speaking congregations in your buildings, like at Calvary. And some of the churches have found very good ways to do this. One of the churches, every fifth Sunday, so there's like 4 fifth Sundays a year, they have an evening service, which they don't normally do. And they choose a person, an English speaker and a Spanish speaker, ahead of time to prepare and share their testimony with an interpreter. And so 4 times a year, or 5 times a year in a strange year, you will get to hear the life story and how God is working and changing in the lives of individuals. And so it's not, it has broken down this barrier of, oh, well, that's them. You can have a joint potluck, but do people sit together? Do they really talk to each other? Do they eat each other's food? So this testimony sharing thing was a way in which there's a mechanism for the church, both the English speakers and the Spanish speakers, to get to know one another as individuals in whom Christ is working. And then a key component has been shared children's and youth ministries. So when you don't have a separate youth group for the Hispanics, you have, and it's really actually kind of good stewardship of leaders, teachers, and building space. So the kids are growing up together, they see each other in school anyhow, they all speak English from the time they start school pretty much, and so they see each other as peers, and there's not this false division that at church, why am I in so-and-so's class at school in 7th grade, but at church I have to go and be in a different room because I'm Hispanic or because I'm white, okay? So this was the kind of model that the medium integration churches followed. But not all churches, the two churches said, we share everything except fellowship. One of them said, we tried. But it just never works, and this is the one in Southern Oregon that said, it's not the Anglos, it's us. I can't get them to go to a joint service for anything. So they're looking for models, and they're casting about and trying to come up with something. So those are the 3 main models that emerged both in what I saw in the churches in Oregon and in the literature that I read about how an English-speaking church and a Spanish-speaking church can work together. And I guess I'll stop here and see if you have any questions. And then I have a few more slides that talk about just maybe some ideas or some tips or some pointers. I know, as I said, some of you are in churches where you work with Spanish speakers. Perhaps others are thinking about it. I don't know where you're coming from, so this is a chance for you to ask or comment or tell me I'm full of baloney and don't know what I'm talking about.
Just one by one, huh?
Not all at once.
I noticed right at the beginning you referred to Hispanic worship as lively, implying probably the Anglos are less lively, which I would say is true. Is it ideal to try to get the Anglos a little more lively and the Hispanics a little less so? Or how do you balance that?
I just read this fascinating book about these big churches like in the LA area where it's very diverse and how their churches are setting out to be English speaking only but multicultural, and so maybe they want to attract African Americans, so they'll hire an African American musician to do gospel music or to do like Southern gospel and kind of promoting a stereotype. I don't think so. I think really the Lord, I'm not a theologian, but my perception is each culture brings something a little bit different and unique to worship, and that's what we're comfortable in. And so I don't think the goal is to make everybody uncomfortable. If you did blend it all the time, nobody would be happy. And so that might be something that would augur for separation occasionally. I don't know. There's definitely, you're right, and there's some research that says actually that some Anglos that are bored with the way that their worship goes, go to Spanish-speaking churches just because the music is more lively. And Spanish-speaking churches in general tend to be much more charismatic. That comes out of Latin America and immigrates with them. And so some of in fact, our denomination has kind of tried to say, okay, let's pull back a little bit on this here. So I don't know what the Mennonite position would be on that, but being slain in the spirit is a little bit frowned on, and so I don't know. But so there's an element of that. I think I don't know. I'm not answering your question very well. You're just getting my musings as they come forward. I think it's okay. I think it's wonderful for me to occasionally participate in a worship service that is very different from what I'm used to. I think that's good occasionally. But if it were every Sunday, I wouldn't like it. I might quit going.
It's the same thing that faces us when we try to do two kinds of contemporary versus traditional worship music.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Same kind of thing. If people are going to be satisfied with if they can give a little, they can do a whole lot.
I know. I hear you, brother. I do.
At some point, your perception change.
Yeah, that's part of that, yeah.
The way you see things.
Yeah. The more I use contemporary worship, the more I can appreciate that. Yeah.
Are there other questions or observations?
What reflected on parallels or contrasts with Catholic experience
I haven't, but one of my students did her senior year, and she was a sociology and Spanish student, and she did a very interesting study on what church meant to people, and Hispanic immigrants, and for the Protestants it seemed to be family, and for the Hispanics it seemed to be maintaining culture, maintaining identity. And less of a family thing. And it's really interesting if you kind of unpack what Mass is supposed to be. It's not necessarily to connect with. I think some of us, when we want to go to church as Protestants, we want to connect with God, we want to worship Him, and we want to be taught. That is not why people go to Mass, or according officially to the Catholic Church. They go to Mass to participate in this sacrament, and their presence is what's important, not learning and not having an experience so much. And so I think maybe I don't know whether the average layperson realizes that or not. There is a struggle for some people who will say, we have friends who have accepted Christ, they're in a Bible study with me, they're praying, they're reading their Bibles, and yet they wouldn't they wouldn't set foot in my church for a worship service for anything, because it would be they would feel like they were betraying who they were because they grew up Catholic. So it's an interesting, I don't know, it's an interesting thing to look at. Yeah. But I didn't visit any masses or anything like that. I do know, I send my students, I make my Spanish students go to a Spanish mass because it's such an important part of Latin American culture. And they come back mad because there are not very many priests that speak Spanish. And so the priest reads the homily in Spanish, but they read it phonetically, and they come back mad. They're saying, I can speak Spanish better than that guy. What are they doing letting him up there up front? And so then what does that mean for you? What does that say to you as a person that goes and the person that's leading and trying to teach you something or read you God's word? You can't understand him? What does that say about your value? And why do you keep going? I mean, it raises a lot of questions, I think. So.
Your husband has been a pastor of Spanish-speaking churches? How
And an English-speaking church.
Okay, how did that compare? Being pastor of an English-speaking church versus a Spanish-speaking?
Well, I was pastoring, I went to help Hispanic churches with the evangelical church in Hopewell. And I don't know if you know where Hopewell is in Oregon. It's just a rural community out of farmers. So for some reason the Anglo pastor got sick. And they said, "You are our pastor now." I said, "No way, Jose." First of all, my first language is Spanish, is no English. I said, "We don't care. I think you do a pretty good job." So I ended up working with both congregations at the same time for 3 years, 4 years, something. It's close to the Mennonite school in Kaiser, around there. Yeah, Hopewell. Hopewell was the evangelical church there. So I have a hard time because we're a lot of old timers, a lot of old people in that Anglo congregation. They didn't want to make changes. Yeah. They didn't have a sign outside, so you saw 100 cars
going. 3 board meetings and information from ODOT to get a banner on the outside of our building. But, I mean, so there was a lot of stuff that was going on. People were very resistant to change, but it had to do with the demographic of an elderly rural community.
There were not that many people around because most of the kids, their kids, they were gone already. It was a rural area, and they didn't want to make, that many changes. Their main focus was the building.
Well, and the building was like 100 years old,
Yeah.
so it eats up all of your budget. And so it was tough. But we did things like that was before we had PowerPoint stuff, so he would put his sermon outline in English on an overhead so the congregation could follow him. And he preached in English, but...
It worked pretty good. I mean, I feel very uncomfortable, that maybe I'm not communicating, because that was the main, in my point of view, and compared with the Catholic, the main idea of going to church is to grab something so you can live with something from the church, some message from God. In the Catholic churches, most of the Hispanic that they go here in the state, they don't get anything. I grew up Catholic in southern of Chile. I grew up in Chile. And even in my own language, I didn't get that much either. All my life, when I become a Christian, is when really I start knowing about God and what God can do in my life. But in that church in particular, the people that were very old, they didn't want to make changes, but they really like it. The difference is that I went out door to door.
He visited a lot.
I visit people. When all the other Anglo pastors, they have just an office. And that was, wow, so that's one of the wonderful things about your culture, that you go out and really knock on doors. I don't think it's about the culture, it's just the things that have changed. That the technology, people, it's stuck with the technology and they forgot what the main purpose of the church is to go out and try to reach the lost. But those differences, things that I have with the Anglo, they really like it, but the things that I feel uncomfortable, and I ask myself, am I communicating with them what God wants me to, to teach you? So those are things.
Well,
let me run real quick through, oh, this is something kind of funny. Well, what do these 9 churches have in common? Like 6 of them are named New Hope. So if you change your church name, it might work. I'm just kidding. The pastors, by and large, were bilingual. All of them were bilingual. Most of the Hispanic ones had come to the United States as relatively young people, as children or as teenagers. So they weren't in culture shock. When Benoit came, he was in culture shock. He came when he was 26. And boom, into the ministry. And I was the interpreter, and that's a stupid thing to do to a young bride. And and in some churches, one of them, the pastor was an Anglo, but he had been a missionary kid, and so he grew up in Central America, and so he was very Central American culturally. And in another church, the Anglo pastor also had been a missionary kid in South America, but there was also a Hispanic pastor, but they had really good communication. So one of the pastors was bilingual. Many of these churches were rural, and I think partly, I mean, some of you guys, your churches are far-flung, and there's not another Mennonite church for miles and miles, or maybe a whole state. And so I think that the believers that were rural, one of the pastors said to me, it's so hard to get to any of my state conference activities. And I sometimes don't even find out about them. And so I think there is a willingness to say, okay, you right there, you're my neighbor, you're right next to me. Now you came from a different country, but you're my brother in Christ, and you're here. Versus my brother in Christ who looks like me, who lives in Salem, and I may never go see. Okay. And then some churches have a strong denominational commitment. I think the Mennonite Church is one of them, given the fact that the earliest churches in Oregon that are Hispanic Protestant churches were Mennonite. The other ones that you saw a lot of Conservative Baptists. In the 1980s, they had a huge push, the Conservative Baptist Northwest, to plant Spanish-speaking churches. So there's just more of them across the state, so that's why more of them ended up in my study. And I think probably, I speculate that in the Northwest, I don't know if you know this or not, but a sociologist of religion has called the Pacific Northwest the none zone. And where you mark what religion you are, and most people in the Northwest mark none. And so we are in the minority. As evangelical believers, we walk out and we're faced with a plethora of other options, and we are in the minority. And so I think there may be just a willingness in the Northwest for us to see our brothers and sisters in Christ of any racial background as having an important bond with us, and perhaps kind of, uniting together against the world that may not exist in other places, maybe in the Bible Belt. So, I don't know. Practical steps. If your church is doing this or thinking about doing this, it has to be born in prayer. This is not something to enter into lightly. It will be difficult. It is difficult. I think it's important to study as a congregation, not just as a pastor or as a small group, but really look at scriptures related to the foreigner, the exile, and the stranger. And my perception is that you Mennonites are way ahead of us Nazarenes on this. I've never heard a sermon in my entire life. I didn't even know these passages were there until I was in my 30s, really, about how we are to treat the foreigner among you. Okay? So it's a theological issue. And so are you going to be able... What is your basis for wanting to enter into this kind of ministry? Is it all going to be, a handout mentality? Or is it going to be really scripturally sound? Really delve into what does it mean to be a Samaritan? It's not just some nice guy with a donkey. I really thought that was what it was about. It's not. Jesus has a whole additional layer of meaning in choosing the Samaritan as the good example. And then you have to really decide, can I believe that that person that speaks Spanish is created in God's image? Can I believe that that person that's created, that is Hispanic, can be my fellow believer and can be chosen and gifted by the Holy Spirit, just like me? And maybe it might teach me something? And then, this is really important, you have to decide what kind of a vision your church has for this congregation, whether it's separation, whether it's going to be assimilating, or whether it's going to be continuing ongoing mutual ministry. This is not just you deciding, but finding a group of people or a pastor, a Spanish-speaking pastor that has a similar vision. Because if you're on two different tracks and you don't know it, or even if you do know it, you're in for a crash. And then, you know, I think churches should be doing this anyhow. But you need to know who lives around you. What's your local community about? Read those 6 books about Oregon Hispanics. Or, not very many. It's not like a whole library full. Look at every county is different. We were really struck driving through Toppenish and Yakima. I'm really curious. I feel another book coming on. What is the Hispanic population here like? It's different in every county. You know, Oregon, Washington County has high percentages of people who are indigenous. They don't speak Spanish as their first language. They're Guatemalan, or they're from the Yucatan Peninsula. You go to Marion County, they're from Michoacan, or they're from Guerrero. They're from a different state in Mexico. And so that influences things. And you probably already know this. It's hard work. Anytime we choose to worship and work with people who have differences than us, and they do not need to be cultural differences, they can be educational differences, they can be socioeconomic level differences. We tend to cluster together and worship with people like us. And when we choose to not do that, we need to choose to do so purposefully, because it's going to be hard work. And then make sure that the non-English speakers are included. So if you're going to have some kind of a joint activity, make sure that they're going to be able to understand. So that's it. Any more questions? I have some copies of my book with me if any of you are interested. One chapter focuses specifically on the history of Oregon Hispanics, but the rest is really kind of description of how these churches work, their relationships with English-speaking churches where they have them, how they do their services, those kinds of things. So, and I'm happy to talk with you individually too if you have questions. Thank you.